Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about Japan and what's called the Meiji Restoration in Japan. We're going to go into the effects of like Western imperialism, which we'll get into kind of what that is in a second, and then we'll we'll kind of go over kind of what happened in Japan from about 1750 to 1900, but also a little bit after 1900 as well. All right, let's get started on that. All right, so imperialism we haven't talked about yet, but we're going to get into it in great detail in the next unit. Is basically building empires, and the in the West, in Britain, in France, the Dutch, which are in the Netherlands, they're all building empires. Russia is kind of building an empire. The Portuguese are kind of still building an empire. Spain, not so much, but they already kind of have a leftover empire. The United States is also building an empire during this time. So you've got this Western imperialism trying to build empires and take over parts of Africa and Asia. That's going to dramatically change Japan. So we're going to quickly go over kind of review Japanese history, and then we'll go into what's happening during this time. You might remember that in ancient Japan, Japan was a territory divided by clans. They borrowed ideas from China, like Buddhism, emperors, writing, architecture. They borrowed a lot of ideas from China. We call that I went blank for a second. Sinification. Sorry, we call that sinification, where sino meaning like China. Things become other countries around it become more like China. So they borrow a lot of things from China, but by the mid 11th century, Japanese feudalism began. And Japanese feudalism is a lot like European feudalism, where you've got the king at the top, but here it's an emperor, the emperor of Japan. There are lords beneath him, but here in Japan, those are called daimyo. And the samurai are kind of like knights. They have their own. They're kind of like a personal fighting force, a personal kind of like a personal army for the lords. And then beneath those people are the peasants, and even the merchants in Japan. The merchants are beneath the peasants, which is kind of different than in Europe. Japan was ruled by regional landowners called daimyo, and the daimyo were served by loyal warriors called samurai. The emperor kind of had little power, so he might be at the top of the social structure, but he didn't have very much power. Most of the power was in the daimyo. The daimyo kind of controlled everything. But then we kind of went over this in the last time we talked about Japan. From 1192 to 1867, Japan was ruled by military dictators called shogun, where the emperor is technically in power, but he doesn't have very much political power. The shogun was the actual ruler and made most of the decisions, and the daimyo kind of were below the shogun. The shogun kind of ruled over the daimyo, and then the warriors were beneath the daimyo from there. The samurai, sorry. From 1560 to 1600, three powerful shogun unified Japan: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and then Tokugawa Ieyasu, who we talked about was the kind of the final unifier of Japan, and brought Japan all together. But it was as these warring daimyo before that each had power. Tokugawa unified Japan, the islands of Japan, into one people under one government, under the Tokugawa. So he unified Japan in 1600. He created a strong line of succession called the Tokugawa Shogunate. They ruled Japan until 1867. But that's all stuff that we've talked about before. European merchants and missionaries then arrived in Japan in the mid 1500s. So the Europeans are starting to come to Japan. They're going to start having effects in Japan. Japanese shogun enjoyed trade with Europeans. They were fascinated by their military and their technology. So they're going to start trading with the Europeans, and Japan's going to become more westernized. They're going to see elements of Western culture and not just borrowed Chinese culture. But I should say that, but Japan has its own very distinct culture as well. They're not just borrowing from everyone else. They're also blending those things with their own culture. So that becomes a very distinct culture, like we see with Shinto. Shinto is a very distinct blend of Buddhism and animist religions. But the rapid conversion of Japanese to Christianity worried Tokugawa, and Tokugawa banned Christianity in 1619. So he banned Christianity, did not allow anyone Christian to come into Japan, starting in 1619. So the Tokugawa shogunate banned all foreign merchants and missionaries. No one from overseas could come into Japan. They adopted a closed country policy, and Japan entered an era of isolation that lasted for 200 years. And I think that's pretty much where we left Japan, was where they had closed their country off to all merchants and foreign missionaries, and they had entered this era of isolation. So that's where we were in. The Japanese allowed one port at Deshima and Nagasaki Bay. They allowed that to remain open, but only to Dutch and Chinese merchants. So the Chinese they accepted because they weren't coming in and changing their culture. The Dutch they allowed because they were partially because they were Protestant instead of Catholic, so they weren't as focused on like making converts as the Catholic Church was during that time. It was partially though because I guess partially because the Dutch were more focused on trading and not as much focused on spreading Christianity. So the Japanese did more than trade with the Dutch. They also learned from them about new Western ideas. So they're not just trading with the Dutch. They're learning from them. They're learning about Western culture. And these Dutch studies helped Japan learn about some of the new scientific and industrial technologies in Europe. So this is when Japan starts becoming more Westernized in their science and in their industry. They You can see a few of those here, a few things that went from the Dutch into Japan. Okay. All right. So then from 1640 to 1853, Japan was isolated while the rest of Asia became imperialized by Western powers. So Japan actually was not part of this European imperialism that was happening in other places until 1853. They were isolated because they didn't allow anyone in except for the Dutch. Then in the early 1800s, Britain, France, and Russia and the United States all tried to negotiate trade rights in Japan. Japan wouldn't let them, but they tried to essentially get a way in to try to trade with Japan because they saw it as being profitable to them. The Japanese repeatedly refused Western trade. They didn't want to trade with these Western nations. So they they stayed isolated pretty much up to then. In 1853, though, we said that was the big kind of shift here. U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Tokyo Harbor with 4 well-armed steamships, and he demanded that the Japanese trade with the United States. So, he brings in these 4 steamships. For one, pretty advanced technology. 2, they're well-armed, so they're pretty they're pretty imposing. And he's demanding, you're going to trade with the United States. We're going to essentially force our way in. Japanese officials realized they were overmatched by U.S. naval ships. They realized they really didn't have much of a choice in this matter, or else they were led to believe that the United States was going to attack them. So when Matthew Perry returned in 1854, Japanese officials signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, which opened 2 ports to American merchants. So keep this in mind because later there's going to be a reaction to this. The Japanese officials agreed to let the Americans trade with them after kind of being pressured into it by Matthew Perry and these ships that essentially kind of forced their way in. But they still made a decision. They decided to sign this treaty to allow trade rights to the United States in Japan. So after the United States opened the door to Japanese trade in 1854, other Western powers entered Japan. And by 1860, England, France, the Dutch, Russia, and the United States all had unequal trade treaties in Japan, which means they essentially got to decide how they were going to trade, what they were going to trade, how much they were going to trade. It's very unequal power wise. And they had extraterritorial rights, which means essentially that when they were in Japan, they didn't have to follow Japanese laws, and they could kind of essentially do what they wanted while in Japan. So the Japanese were angry that the shogun had given in to to foreigners' demands, and he feared that Japan would become as powerless as China. Um, as China is. We'll get more into what's happening in China during this time, but China had been taken over by these Western powers, and the Japanese were so angry that the shogun had given into the foreigners' demands. Is they started protesting. They started kind of speaking up against the government. And in 1867, the Tokugawa shogun stepped down, which brought an end to 600 years of military dictatorship. Emperor Mutsuhito took control of the government, and he took the title Meiji, which means enlightened rule, and that's where we get what's called the Meiji Restoration in Japan. Now, you might notice this is Emperor Mutsuhito, and you might notice, hey, he looks very Western, doesn't he? He has the beard, he has the Western style military dress, and the Western style haircut. He looks very much like, you could take this person, he could look like an American, basically, from the era. The Meiji Emperor realized that the best way to end Western influence was to modernize. So he modernized the Japanese economy. He sent diplomats to Europe and America to study Western ways and adapt them to their own country. So they came back and they changed their government. Japan admired Germany's government, and they used it as a model to create a new constitution and a new parliament. And then Japanese leaders eagerly supported industrialization. They began building modern factories. They built railroads, steamships, and steel bridges. All of those came during this time, and Japan became very Western during the Meiji Restoration. They copied a lot of things that are happening in the West, like in Western Europe and the United States. They built a modern military by modeling their army after the Germans and their navy over the British. They're taking a lot from the Germans. I wonder if they might, have an alliance with Germany a little bit later in the 1900s because of that. One of the world wars. So they modeled their army after the Germans. They modeled their navy after the British. And Japanese officials reformed education using models from German, American, and French public schools. So they had a new kind of education system. Western fashions became popular in Japan. This looks like Americans a lot, right? Looks like this came straight out of Western Europe and not from Japan. Oops, sorry. Okay. Modernization in the Meiji era transformed Japan into the most industrial and militarized nation in Asia. So by 1900, Japan had 7,000 miles of railroad track, thousands of factories, profitable tea, silk, and shipbuilding industries, and a modern army and navy. And the Meiji reforms gave Japan power and respect. Japanese nationalism led to the end of Western extraterritorial rights and these unequal trade treaties. So they kind of built a Japanese nationalism and eventually were powerful enough that they could put an end to these Westerners coming into their country and doing these things and having these unequal trade treaties with them and stuff like that. So by the 1890s, Japan saw itself as a modern nation that needed raw materials. And like other industrialized nations, Japan began to imperialize in Asia. So they took parts like China and Russia, and they decided to take to take their own territories, just like the West had done. Japan looked to take Korea, but China always had claim to the land. So the dispute with China over Korea resulted in what's called the Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895, and in that war, Japan defeated the Chinese army and they destroyed the Chinese navy. So for their victory, Japan gained Taiwan, which is right down here, and they gained spheres of influence in China, meaning that they had these extraterritorial rights. They could go in and they could go in and trade in China and make money off of China, because China was not very powerful at this time and couldn't really do anything to stop them. So this is a perfect example of how the Japanese saw themselves as totally different from the Chinese. So they go from borrowing a lot of Chinese culture and Chinese language and stuff like that to now they see themselves as more similar to the Westerners who you see behind the Chinese here, and over here on the left are the Japanese. So you can see there that they see themselves as way more similar to the Westerners than they do the Chinese, but just based on how they're dressed and how they look. I mean, these look like Western military leaders instead of what we think of Japan. So after Japan's victory over China, a rivalry developed between Japan and Russia. And from 1904 to 1905, the Russo-Japanese War, which means between Russia and the United States, Russia and Japan, that began over control of Port Arthur and Manchuria. During the war, Japan shocked the world by defeating a Western power, not only a Western power, but one that's much, much, much bigger than them, has much, much, much more territory than them, and a lot more raw materials than they do, but they defeat them anyway. So in 1905, U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt helped draft a treaty that gave Korea to Japan and then removed Russia from Manchuria. So Japan's victories over China and Russia transformed Japan into the dominant force in Asia. They become the dominant Asian power, and Western nations relied on Japan to keep order in Asia. But unfortunately, as we get into the 1930s and 1940s, which we will at another time, Japanese imperialism surged again at that point, and that became a focal point of World War II. Not only the Germans, who we see trying to build an empire, but the Japanese try to build an empire in the 1930s and 1940s as well, and try to expand. And that becomes a problem during World War II. So that's all we have for right now. We'll come back to Japan in Unit 7 as we look at what's happening in these world wars. But for now, that's what you need to know for this unit, from 1750 to 1900-ish. And I hope you have a good day.